The rope scratched against Katherine Davis's neck as she stood on the wooden platform in the middle of Animas Forks, Colorado, her breath creating small clouds in the crisp autumn air of 1875. The crowd that had gathered in the town square shifted restlessly, some with hungry eyes eager for the spectacle of death, others averting their gaze in shame or discomfort. Sheriff William Blackstone adjusted his hat, his weathered face betraying no emotion as he prepared to carry out what he called justice. Katherine's hands were bound behind her back, her dark hair falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her once fine dress was now smudged with dirt from the jail cell where she'd spent the past 3 days. She scanned the crowd, wondering if she would find a single sympathetic face before the floor dropped out beneath her. "Katherine Davis," Sheriff Blackstone's voice boomed across the square, "you have been found guilty of murder and theft. Do you have any final words before your sentence is carried out?" Katherine raised her chin, her green eyes flashing with defiance despite her fear. "I am innocent," she declared, her voice stronger than she felt. "Someone in this town knows the truth," the sheriff scoffed. "That's what they all say." He moved toward the lever that would send her plummeting to her death. At the edge of the crowd, Thomas Marshall watched with a white-knuckled grip on the reins of his horse. He had ridden into town just an hour earlier, following rumors and whispers that had reached him at his camp in the mountains. His weathered face was partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but his blue eyes were sharp and focused. He had never seen the woman on the gallows before today, but something in her defiant stance stirred something within him. As the sheriff reached for the lever, Thomas made his decision. In one fluid motion, he drew his Colt revolver, aimed at the rope above Katherine's head, and fired. The shot cracked through the air like thunder. The rope snapped, frayed strands flying apart as the bullet tore through it. Katherine dropped slightly but not far enough to break her neck or suffocate. Instead, she landed hard on her feet on the platform, stumbling to her knees with a cry of surprise. Chaos erupted in the square. Women screamed, men shouted, and Sheriff Blackstone whirled around, his own gun already drawn. "Who fired that shot?" he bellowed, his face flushing red with fury. Thomas spurred his horse forward, pushing through the panicking crowd. "The lady deserves a fair trial, Sheriff," he called out, his voice carrying over the din. "Not this mockery of justice." Sheriff Blackstone aimed his gun at Thomas. "You're interfering with the law, Cowboy. That's a hanging offense in itself." "A trial with evidence is the law," Thomas replied, his horse dancing nervously beneath him as he approached the gallows. "Not your word alone." Katherine had managed to struggle to her feet, still bound and with the noose hanging loosely around her neck. Her eyes locked with Thomas's, confusion and desperate hope warring in her expression. Thomas made a split-second decision. He urged his horse up the steps of the gallows platform, a feat that made the crowd gasp, leaned down, and extended his arm to Katherine. "Trust me," he said simply. Without hesitation, Katherine moved toward him. With strength born of desperation, she jumped, and Thomas caught her around the waist, pulling her up onto his horse. The sheriff fired a shot that whistled past Thomas's ear, but he was already wheeling his horse around, Katherine clinging to him as they plunged into the crowd. People scattered before the charging horse, and Thomas navigated through the chaos with skill born of years on the frontier. More shots rang out behind them, but they were already reaching the edge of town, the horse's powerful strides eating up the distance. "Hold tight," Thomas shouted over his shoulder as they headed for the cover of the thick pine forest that surrounded Animas Forks. Katherine pressed her face against his back, her bound hands clutching his coat. She had no choice but to trust this stranger who had just risked his life to save hers, though she had no idea why he would do such a thing. They rode hard for nearly an hour, following deer trails and crossing streams to throw off any pursuers. Only when Thomas was certain they weren't being followed did he finally slow the horse to a walk and guide it toward a small clearing hidden within a grove of aspen trees. "We'll rest here for a bit," he said, dismounting and turning to help Katherine down. She was shaking, whether from cold, fear, or the lingering shock of her near execution. Thomas couldn't tell. Her wrists were raw and bleeding from the ropes, and the noose still hung around her neck like a macabre necklace. "Let me help you with those," Thomas said gently, reaching for his knife. He carefully cut away the ropes binding her wrists, then removed the noose from her neck, tossing it into the underbrush with disgust. "Thank you," Katherine said, her voice hoarse. She rubbed her wrists, wincing at the pain. "But why? Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Thomas walked to his saddlebag and removed a small canteen, offering it to her. "I've seen Sheriff Blackstone's kind of justice before, quick to hang, slow to listen, especially when it comes to women or anyone who can't defend themselves properly." He paused, studying her face. "And something told me you were telling the truth about being innocent." Katherine took a long drink from the canteen, the cool water soothing her parched throat. "I am innocent. I was accused of murdering Jacob Reynolds and stealing money from his safe, but I didn't do it. I was working as his housekeeper, and I found him dead when I arrived that morning." "Then why did they blame you?" She looked away, her expression hardening. "Because I was convenient. Because I was alone in this world with no one to speak for me. And because Jacob had recently changed his will to leave me a portion of his estate, though I knew nothing about it until the sheriff mentioned it during my so-called trial." Thomas nodded slowly. "Someone else wanted that money and you were in the way." "Yes." Katherine handed the canteen back to him, their fingers brushing briefly. "But I don't know who. Jacob was a private man, and I'd only been working for him for 6 months. "Well," Thomas said, securing the canteen back to his saddle, "we can figure that out later. Right now, we need to put more distance between us and Anima's Forks. The sheriff won't take kindly to having his authority challenged, and he'll be coming after both of us now." "I'm sorry I've dragged you into this," Katherine said, genuine regret in her voice. Thomas offered a small smile. "I dragged myself in, madam, and I don't regret it." "Katherine," she said. "Katherine Davis." "Thomas Marshall," he replied with a slight tip of his hat. "Now, Miss Davis, can you ride?" "Yes," she nodded. "My father taught me before he passed." "Good, we've got a long journey ahead." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Thomas helped Katherine back onto his horse. They would need to find better shelter before night fell completely, and Thomas knew just the place, an old trapper's cabin about 2 hours' ride deeper into the mountains. As they rode, Katherine's body gradually relaxed against Thomas's back, the rhythmic motion of the horse and the quiet sounds of the forest calming her frayed nerves. She was still terrified, still reeling from how close she had come to death, but for the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. This strange, brave man had risked everything to save her life, and somehow she trusted him. Thomas, for his part, was already plotting their next moves. They would need supplies, and eventually, they would need to clear Katherine's name. The thought of continuing to run didn't sit well with him. He'd spent too many years wandering, never setting down roots, always moving on before connections could form. But he couldn't deny that something about Katherine Davis had compelled him to act, to involve himself in her fate when he could have simply ridden past the town square without a second glance. The cabin appeared just as darkness was fully descending, a small, rough structure nestled against a rocky outcropping. It wasn't much, but it would provide shelter for the night. "It's not the finest accommodation," Thomas said as he helped Katherine dismount, but it'll keep us warm and hidden." Katherine looked at the cabin, then back at Thomas. "After spending 3 days in a jail cell thinking I was going to die, this looks like a palace." Thomas smiled, a genuine warmth reaching his eyes this time. "That's the spirit, Miss Davis." He led his horse to a small lean-to beside the cabin, making sure the animal was secure and had water from a nearby stream. Then he and Katherine entered the cabin. It was dusty but otherwise in decent condition. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and basic furniture, a table, 2 chairs, and a narrow bed filled the single room. "I'll get a fire going," Thomas said, moving to gather some of the stacked firewood near the hearth. "It gets cold up here at night, even in autumn." Katherine looked around the cabin, taking in the sparse surroundings. "Do you know whose cabin this is?" "An old trapper named Jensen. He died last winter. No family that I know of, so no one's claimed it." Thomas struck a match, lighting the kindling he'd arranged. "I stop by sometimes when I'm in these mountains." "And what brings you to these mountains, Mr. Marshall?" Katherine asked, settling into one of the chairs, her exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. Thomas focused on the growing flames, feeding larger pieces of wood into the fire. "I was tracking a herd of wild horses. I break them and sell them to ranchers and stagecoach companies." He glanced up at her. "But I heard rumors in the last mining camp I passed through. Talk of a woman being sentenced to hang in Anima's Forks without proper evidence. I decided to see for myself." Katherine's expression softened. "So you came all this way on a rumor? To help someone you didn't even know?" Thomas shrugged, looking slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I've seen too many injustices in my time. Sometimes a man has to take a stand, even if it's not the easiest path." The fire was blazing now, casting a warm glow throughout the cabin and highlighting the angles of Thomas's face. Katherine studied him openly for the first time. He was a handsome man, she realized, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years outdoors, and kind eyes that belied the hardness of his profession. His dark blonde hair was a bit too long, curling slightly at the nape of his neck, and a few days' worth of stubble covered his jaw. "Well," she said softly, "I'm grateful you decided to take that stand today." Their eyes met across the small space, and something unspoken passed between them, a connection that neither could explain but both felt keenly. The moment was broken when Katherine's stomach growled loudly, reminding them both of more practical concerns. Thomas grinned. "Sounds like we should see about some food. I have some jerky and biscuits in my saddlebag. Not much of a feast, I'm afraid." "It sounds perfect," Katherine assured him. They ate a simple meal by the fire, talking quietly as the night deepened around the cabin. Katherine told Thomas about her life, how she'd been orphaned at 16 when her parents died of influenza, how she'd worked various jobs to support herself before finding the position as Jacob Reynolds's housekeeper. Thomas shared bits of his own story growing up on a ranch in Texas, leaving home at 18 to make his own way, the years spent working as a ranch hand, a scout, and finally finding his calling with horses. "I've never stayed in one place too long," he admitted, staring into the fire. "Always something pulling me to the next horizon." "And now?" Katherine asked. "What's pulling you now?" Thomas looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Right now, the need to see justice done, to make sure you don't hang for a crime you didn't commit." "You really believe I'm innocent, don't you?" "I do," he said simply. "And I aim to help you prove it." Katherine felt tears welling in her eyes, overwhelmed by this stranger's faith and kindness. "Thank you," she whispered. Thomas nodded, a bit awkward in the face of her emotion. He stood, stretching. "You should take the bed, get some rest. I'll keep watch for a while." Katherine didn't argue, her body aching with exhaustion. She moved to the narrow bed, sitting on the edge to remove her boots. The reality of her situation, a fugitive, alone in a cabin with a man she just met, should have frightened her, but instead she felt safer than she had in days. "Good night, Thomas," she said, lying down on the rough blanket. "Good night, Katherine," he replied, his voice low and gentle in the firelit cabin. She fell asleep watching him sit by the window, his profile outlined by the dying fire, his presence a comfort in the wilderness that surrounded them. Dawn broke clear and cold over the mountains, sunlight filtering through the cabin's single window. Katherine woke slowly, momentarily disoriented before the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up quickly, looking around the cabin. Thomas was asleep in one of the chairs, his long legs stretched out before him, his hat tilted over his eyes. His chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of deep sleep, and Katherine realized he must have been exhausted from their escape and the long ride. She rose quietly, trying not to wake him. Her dress was wrinkled and dirty, bearing evidence of her time in jail and their hasty flight. She smoothed it as best she could, then moved to the small basin of water Thomas had left on the table. She washed her face and hands, the cool water refreshing against her skin. Outside, Thomas's horse nickered softly, and Katherine decided to check on the animal. She slipped out of the cabin into the crisp morning air, breathing deeply of the pine-scented breeze. The mountain landscape spread out before her, vast and beautiful, making her feel small but somehow free. The horse greeted her with another soft noise, and Katherine approached cautiously, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Hello, handsome," she murmured, reaching out to stroke his neck. "Thank you for carrying us to safety yesterday." "His name is Copper," came Thomas's voice from behind her. Katherine turned to see him standing in the cabin doorway, hat back in place, watching her with a small smile. "He seems to like you." "I've always had a way with animals," she replied, continuing to stroke Copper's neck. "More than with people sometimes." Thomas joined her, checking on his horse. "He's a good judge of character, doesn't take to just anyone." Katherine watched as Thomas expertly examined Copper's legs and hooves, his movements gentle but confident. "What's our plan now?" she asked. Thomas straightened, meeting her gaze. "We need supplies. There's a small settlement about half a day's ride from here, not much more than a trading post and a few cabins. I know the man who runs it, Jim Cooper. He's a fair sort, won't ask too many questions." "And then," Katherine pressed, "I can't keep running forever, Thomas." "I need to clear my name," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I've been thinking about that. The key is finding out who really killed Jacob Reynolds. Do you have any ideas? Anyone who might have wanted him dead?" Katherine frowned, considering. "He didn't have many visitors, but there was his nephew, Victor. He came by about a month ago, seemed angry about something. They argued behind closed doors, but I could hear their raised voices." "Victor," Thomas repeated. "Do you know his full name? Where he lives?" "Victor Reynolds." "I believe he lives in Denver. He mentioned business there." "That's something," Thomas said. "We could start by finding him, seeing what he knows. But first, we need those supplies." They ate a quick breakfast of the remaining biscuits, then prepared to leave the cabin. Thomas was careful to erase any signs of their presence, explaining that Sheriff Blackstone might have a posse out looking for them by now. "You think they'd follow us this far?" Katherine asked, as she watched him scatter the ashes from their fire. "Blackstone struck me as the type who doesn't like to be made a fool of," Thomas replied grimly. "And that's exactly what I did, shooting that rope in front of the whole town. He'll want to save face, and that means finding us." The reality of their situation, that Thomas had made himself a wanted man to save her, hit Katherine anew. "I'm so sorry for putting you in danger," she said quietly. Thomas paused in his work, looking up at her. You didn't put me in danger, Katherine. I chose this path. And I'd make the same choice again. Their eyes held for a long moment before Thomas broke the connection, turning to finish his task. We should get moving. It's a long ride to Cooper's trading post. They rode double on Copper again, Katherine sitting behind Thomas with her arms wrapped around his waist. The terrain was rough, climbing higher into the mountains before descending into a valley. They spoke little during the journey, both lost in their own thoughts, but the silence between them was comfortable rather than strained. By midday, they reached a small clearing where a cluster of buildings stood the trading post Thomas had mentioned. Smoke curled from the chimney of the largest structure and a few horses were hitched outside. Thomas reined Copper to a stop at the edge of the trees, surveying the scene cautiously. Looks quiet enough, but we should be careful. I'll go in first, see if there's any news about us. Wait here with Copper. Katherine nodded, sliding off the horse as Thomas dismounted. Be careful, she urged. Always am, he replied with a quick smile before heading toward the trading post. Katherine led Copper deeper into the trees, finding a spot where they were hidden from view, but she could still see the buildings. She stroked the horse's neck absently, anxiety knotting her stomach as she waited. Thomas was gone longer than she expected, nearly half an hour, and she was beginning to worry when she finally saw him emerge from the trading post. He was carrying a bundle and walking with purpose back toward the trees, his expression neutral. What is it? Katherine asked as soon as he reached her. What did you find out? Thomas handed her the bundle, a simple dress, some food, and other basic supplies. Word travels fast. There are wanted posters for both of us already. Sheriff Blackstone is offering $100 for information leading to our capture. Katherine's heart sank. So soon? He must have had them printed right after we escaped and sent riders out with them. Thomas untied his saddlebag, stowing the food inside. Jim Cooper's a friend. He warned me there were 2 men from Anima's Forks here yesterday, asking questions. They've moved on, but they could be back. What do we do now? Katherine asked, clutching the new dress to her chest. We change our plans. Thomas's expression was determined. We can't risk going to Denver, not with those posters circulating. We need to find proof of your innocence closer to home. But how? Jacob Reynolds's house. The answers have to be there, something the sheriff overlooked or ignored. We need to go back to Anima's Forks. Katherine stared at him in disbelief. That's madness. The sheriff will be watching for us. Not if we're careful, Thomas countered. We'll approach from the mountains, wait for night. I know these woods better than any posse from town. Katherine shook her head, fear evident in her eyes. It's too dangerous. I can't ask you to risk your life again. Thomas stepped closer, his gaze intense. Katherine, listen to me. Running will only get us so far. They'll keep looking and eventually they'll find us. Our only chance is to prove your innocence, to find the real killer. Katherine knew he was right, but the thought of returning to the town where she'd nearly died terrified her. What if we fail? We won't, Thomas said with a certainty that surprised her. I don't know why, but I believe we were meant to find each other yesterday. I believe there's a purpose to all this. His conviction was contagious, and Katherine found herself nodding slowly. All right, we'll go back. Thomas squeezed her shoulder gently. First, you should change. That dress is too recognizable. Katherine glanced down at her dirty, torn garment. You're right. I'll just be a moment. She moved deeper into the trees for privacy, quickly changing into the simple blue dress Thomas had purchased. It was plain but clean and fit reasonably well. She used the small comb from the bundle to tidy her hair, then rejoined Thomas. He looked at her with appreciation in his eyes. Better. You'll attract less attention now. They mounted Copper again and set off, this time heading southwest, following game trails and keeping to the cover of the forest. Thomas explained his plan as they rode. They would approach Anima's Forks from the west, where the forest grew closest to the town. They would wait in the trees until nightfall, then make their way to Reynolds's house under cover of darkness. "You know if anyone's living there now?" Thomas asked. "I don't think so," Katherine replied. "Jacob had no family except Victor, and he lives in Denver. The house might be locked up until the estate is settled." "That works in our favor. We'll have time to search without interruption." They rode for the remainder of the day, stopping only briefly to rest Copper and eat some of the food Thomas had purchased. As the sun began to set, painting the mountain peaks in gold and pink, they reached a ridge overlooking Anima's Forks. The town looked peaceful from a distance. Buildings clustered along the main street, smoke rising from chimneys, the church steeple standing tall against the darkening sky. It was hard to believe that just yesterday it had been the site of such injustice and violence. "There," Katherine said, pointing to a two-story house set slightly apart from the others near the edge of town. "That's Jacob's house." Thomas nodded, studying the layout of the town. "Good. It's relatively isolated. We'll approach from the back through those trees." They dismounted, leading Copper to a small stream to drink while they waited for full darkness. As they sat side by side on a fallen log, watching the lights of the town begin to twinkle in the dusk, Katherine found herself studying Thomas's profile. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked softly. "There must be more to it than just a dislike of injustice." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant town. "My sister," he finally said, his voice low. "Her name was Emily. She was accused of theft by a rancher's wife who'd lost a brooch. The local sheriff was sweet on the rancher's wife, took her word over Emily's." He paused, and Katherine waited, sensing there was more to the story. "They didn't hang her, but they put her in jail. Conditions were bad, damp, cold. She caught pneumonia. By the time I heard about it and got there, she was already gone." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. "She was innocent. The brooch turned up later, fallen behind a dresser, but it was too late for Emily." "Oh, Thomas," Katherine breathed, reaching out to touch his arm. "I'm so sorry." He covered her hand with his own. "I couldn't save her, but when I saw you standing on that gallows, something inside me I couldn't let it happen again, not when I could do something." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes, moved by his confession and the pain she could see etched in his features. Without thinking, she leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Thank you for telling me, and thank you for saving my life." Thomas turned to face her, their faces close in the gathering darkness. For a breathless moment, Katherine thought he might kiss her. Instead, he reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch feather light. "We should get ready," he said, his voice husky. "It's almost dark enough." They made their final preparations in silence, each aware of the shift in the air between them, the deepening of their connection. Thomas tied Copper securely in a small grove where the horse would have grass and water, explaining that they would return before dawn. As full darkness descended, they began their cautious approach toward Anima's Forks, moving through the trees like shadows. Thomas led the way, his steps sure and silent, with Katherine following close behind. The town was mostly quiet now, though light and occasional laughter spilled from the saloon on the main street. They skirted the edge of town, keeping to the darkest paths until they reached the back of Jacob Reynolds's house. It stood dark and still, confirming Katherine's belief that it was unoccupied. "The back door will be locked," she whispered as they crouched in the shadow of a large oak tree, "but there's a window in the kitchen that doesn't latch properly." "I've been meaning to tell Jacob about it," she broke off, realizing with a pang that Jacob was beyond caring about such things now. Thomas squeezed her hand reassuringly. "Show me." They crept to the window Katherine had mentioned, and Thomas easily managed to open it after a brief inspection. He helped Katherine through first, then followed, both of them landing quietly on the kitchen floor. The house was eerily silent, filled with the stillness that comes when a dwelling has been suddenly emptied of life. Moonlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the floors and walls. "We should check his study first," Katherine suggested. "That's where he kept all his important papers and his safe." She led the way through the dark house, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the layout well. The study was at the front of the house, a handsome room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large oak desk. "The safe is behind that painting," Katherine said, pointing to a landscape on the wall behind the desk. Thomas moved the painting aside, revealing a small wall safe. "It's still locked," he observed. "If someone stole money from it, they either had the combination or forced it open." "But there's no sign of force. Jacob kept the combination in his diary," Katherine said, moving to the desk and opening the top drawer. "He thought no one would think to look there." She rifled through the drawer but frowned. "It's not here." Thomas joined her at the desk, both of them searching through the drawers. What did this diary look like? Small, leather-bound, with his initials stamped in gold on the cover. They searched the entire study but found no trace of the diary. Thomas sat back on his heels, thoughtful. If the killer knew about the diary and the combination, they might have taken it with them after opening the safe. But how would they know about it? Jacob was very private. I only knew because I caught him writing in it once, and he told me that's where he kept all his important information. Thomas's eyes narrowed. Someone close to him, then, someone he might have told. "Victor," Katherine said suddenly. "His nephew. Jacob mentioned once that Victor was his only living relative, that he'd be leaving everything to him someday." "But then he changed his will to include you," Thomas noted. "When did that happen?" Katherine thought back, trying to remember. "I'm not sure exactly. I didn't even know about it until the sheriff mentioned it after my arrest. But it must have been recent." "And when did Victor visit last?" "About a month ago. They argued, as I mentioned." Thomas stood, pacing the study. "It fits. Victor learns his uncle has changed his will, cutting into his inheritance. He comes to confront Jacob about it. When that doesn't work, he decides on a more permanent solution." "But why frame me?" Katherine asked. "Because you were the beneficiary of the change. With you convicted of Jacob's murder, you couldn't inherit. The original will would stand and Victor would get everything." Katherine nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. "It makes sense. But we need proof, not just theories." They continued searching the study, careful not to disturb anything too noticeably. In a hidden compartment in the desk that Katherine hadn't known about, Thomas found a letter from Jacob's lawyer confirming the change to his will. It was dated just 6 weeks earlier. "Look at this," he said, showing it to Katherine. "This proves the timing. Victor could have known about the change by the time he visited." Katherine read the letter, then looked up at Thomas with renewed determination. "We need to find something that places Victor at the scene of the murder, something the sheriff overlooked." They moved methodically through the house, searching each room. In Jacob's bedroom, Katherine noticed something odd. A small, carved wooden box on the dresser was open, its contents apparently undisturbed. "That's strange," she murmured, approaching it. "Jacob always kept this box locked. It contained his wife's jewelry. She died years ago, but he kept her things." Thomas joined her, examining the box. "The lock's been forced," he observed, pointing to small scratches around the keyhole. Katherine carefully looked through the items in the box. "The diamond earrings are missing," she said. "They were his wife's most valuable possession. He showed them to me once." "The sheriff didn't mention any jewelry being stolen," Thomas noted. "Just money from the safe." Because he didn't know they existed, Katherine explained. Jacob kept them private, a memory of his wife. He wouldn't have displayed them or talked about them to many people. But Victor would have known, Thomas said, understanding dawning in his eyes. As Jacob's nephew, he would have known about his aunt's jewelry. They continued their search, moving to the parlor at the front of the house. Katherine was explaining where Jacob had been found when Thomas suddenly grabbed her arm, pulling her down below the window. "Someone's coming," he whispered urgently. Katherine's heart hammered in her chest as she heard footsteps on the front porch, followed by the sound of a key in the lock. The front door creaked open and a lamp flared to life in the entryway. "Just as we left it," came a man's voice, unfamiliar to Katherine. "No sign of disturbance." "Check the study again," replied another man, a voice Katherine recognized with a chill as Sheriff Blackstone's. "Make sure the safe is still secure." Thomas motioned for Katherine to follow him, and they crawled silently toward the back of the house, keeping low and in the shadows. They reached the kitchen just as they heard footsteps entering the study. "We need to go," Thomas mouthed, pointing to the open window. Katherine nodded and Thomas helped her through the window first. As she landed outside, she heard a shout from within the house. "Sheriff, the window's open." Thomas vaulted through the window just as a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the window frame inches from his head. He grabbed Katherine's hand, and they ran for the trees, the shouts of the sheriff and his deputy echoing behind them. "They're heading for the woods," Blackstone bellowed. "Sound the alarm." A bell began to toll in the town, the fire bell, Katherine realized, used to summon help. Soon the whole town would be searching for them. Thomas pulled her deeper into the forest, his grip on her hand firm but gentle. "We need to get to Copper and ride out of here," he said, his breath coming in quick bursts as they ran. They reached the spot where they'd left the horse, and Thomas quickly untied him. "Did you find what we needed?" Katherine asked as Thomas helped her onto Copper's back. "Not enough," Thomas admitted, swinging up behind her and taking the reins. "But I have an idea. If Victor stole those earrings, he'll either still have them or have sold them. If we can find them, then we can prove he was there," Katherine finished. Thomas urged Copper into a gallop, heading away from the town. Behind them, the bell continued to ring, and faint shouts could be heard as men organized a search party. They rode hard for several miles before Thomas finally slowed Copper to a walk, the horse's sides heaving from the exertion. "We've lost them for now," he said, "but they'll be searching the mountains come daylight." "What's your idea?" Katherine asked, turning slightly to look at him. "How do we find Victor and the earrings?" "Denver," Thomas replied. "That's where he lives, right?" "We head there, find him, search his place if necessary." "Denver's at least 4 days' ride from here," Katherine pointed out. "Not if we take the train," Thomas countered. "There's a station at Silver Creek about a day's ride south. We can be in Denver in 2 days." Katherine considered this. "But won't they be watching the trains?" "The wanted posters will need disguises," Thomas acknowledged. "And we'll have to be careful, but it's our best chance, Katherine. If we stay in these mountains, they'll find us eventually." She knew he was right. All right, to Denver then. They found shelter for what remained of the night in another abandoned mining shack, this one smaller and more dilapidated than Jensen's cabin. They took turns keeping watch, neither of them able to sleep much after the narrow escape from the sheriff. As dawn broke, they set out again, heading south toward Silver Creek. They rode steadily throughout the day, stopping only when necessary to rest Copper. Thomas proved to be an excellent guide, finding paths through the wilderness that Katherine would never have noticed. They talked as they rode, sharing more of their lives. Katherine learned that Thomas had been born on a cattle ranch near San Antonio, the youngest of 3 children. After his sister's death, he drifted northward, working various jobs before discovering his talent for breaking wild horses. "I understand them," he explained. "Wild things that just need patience and respect." In turn, Katherine told him about growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a clerk. Her parents had moved to Colorado when her father developed a lung condition, hoping the mountain air would help. For a few years, it had, but eventually, the influenza that swept through their town had taken both her parents within a week of each other. "I had no other family," she said. "No choice but to find work and support myself." "You're stronger than you know," Thomas told her, his admiration evident in his voice. They reached Silver Creek by nightfall, a larger settlement than Anima's Forks with a proper railway station. They made camp outside of town, and Thomas rode in alone to purchase train tickets for the following morning, and to see if the wanted posters had reached this far. He returned with both tickets and confirmation that the posters were indeed displayed at the station and the sheriff's office. "How will we get past them?" Katherine asked worriedly. Thomas unpacked the bundle he'd brought back with him. "With these." He handed her a plain brown dress, different from the blue one she now wore, along with a shawl and a wide-brimmed bonnet that would conceal much of her face. For himself, he had purchased a respectable-looking suit jacket, a different hat, and a pair of spectacles. "You'll be Mrs. Thomas Mitchell, my wife, traveling to Denver to visit your ailing mother," he explained. "I've marked your ticket with a different name, and I'll be using my middle initial instead of my first name." Katherine smiled despite the tension of their situation. "You've thought of everything." "Not everything," Thomas admitted with a rueful smile, "but I'm trying." The next morning they approached the station separately as planned. Katherine entered first, her head bowed beneath the bonnet, the shawl pulled tight around her shoulders despite the warmth of the day. She purchased a newspaper and sat on a bench, pretending to read while waiting for the train. Thomas arrived 10 minutes later, looking remarkably different in his jacket and spectacles, his usual confident stride replaced by a more measured walk. He nodded politely to the station master, then joined Katherine on the bench, sitting close but not too close. The train arrived with a blast of its whistle and a cloud of steam, passengers disembarking before new ones could board. Katherine and Thomas waited until most had boarded before standing. Just as they moved toward the train, a man in a marshal's uniform entered the station, scanning the remaining passengers. Thomas took Katherine's arm, guiding her smoothly toward the train, his body partially shielding her from the marshal's view. They boarded without incident, finding seats near the back of the passenger car. Only when the train lurched into motion, pulling away from the station, did Katherine release the breath she'd been holding. "That was close," she whispered. Thomas nodded, still watching out the window as Silver Creek receded into the distance. "Too close. But we made it. Next stop, Denver." The train journey took all day and part of the next, the locomotive winding its way down from the mountains into the more populated foothills, and eventually the plains where Denver sprawled along the South Platte River. Katherine and Thomas maintained their disguises throughout the trip, speaking little in public and always as husband and wife. In the privacy of their conversations, however, a deeper connection continued to grow. Thomas found himself drawn to Katherine's resilience and quiet intelligence, while she admired his courage and unwavering sense of justice. Neither spoke of these feelings directly, but the glances they exchanged, the way their hands would occasionally brush as they passed a canteen or parcel between them, told a story of its own. By the time they arrived in Denver, a bustling city compared to the mountain towns they'd left behind, they had formulated a plan. Victor Reynolds was a businessman, involved in mining investments according to what Katherine remembered from overheard conversations. They would need to find his office or home, observe his movements, and find a way to search for evidence specifically, the missing diamond earrings. They found lodging in a modest boarding house on the outskirts of the city, Thomas presenting them as a married couple passing through on business. The elderly woman who owned the establishment showed them to a small room with a double bed, causing both to exchange an awkward glance. "I'll sleep on the floor," Thomas said immediately once they were alone. Katherine nodded, a blush coloring her cheeks. "Thank you." They ventured into the city the next morning, Thomas having traded his horse copper for a decent sum of money before they boarded the train. Denver was overwhelming to Katherine, who had spent the last few years in the relative quiet of Anima's Forks. The streets teemed with people, carriages, and wagons, while brick buildings rose 3 and 4 stories high on either side. Their first task was to locate Victor Reynolds. Thomas suggested they start with the business directory at the post office, and there they found their first piece of luck. Reynolds was listed as a partner in Reynolds and Whitaker Mining Investments, with an office address on Larimer Street. They found the building easily enough, a respectable 3-story structure with various businesses occupying different floors. Reynolds and Whitaker was on the 2nd floor, according to the directory in the lobby. "Now what?" Katherine whispered as they stood across the street observing the building. "Now we wait," Thomas replied. "We need to see Victor, confirm it's him, and learn his routine. Where he goes, where he lives." They took up position at a small cafe with outdoor seating that afforded a view of the building's entrance. They ordered coffee and pastries, settling in for what might be a long wait. It was nearly noon when a man exited the building, and Katherine tensed beside Thomas. "That's him," she said quietly. "That's Victor Reynolds." Thomas studied the man, tall, well-dressed, with the same dark hair as his late uncle but lacking the kindness Katherine had described in Jacob. He carried himself with an air of importance, nodding curtly to those who greeted him as he made his way down the street. "Let's follow him," Thomas suggested. "See where he goes for lunch. It might be a regular habit we can use." They trailed Victor at a discreet distance, Thomas keeping his arm around Katherine's waist to maintain their cover as a couple. Victor led them to an upscale restaurant several blocks away, where he was greeted by name and shown to what appeared to be his usual table. "He'll be there for at least an hour," Thomas observed. "Let's go back to his office, see what we can find out." They returned to the building, Thomas leading the way with a confident stride that suggested he belonged there. Inside, they climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, finding the door marked Reynolds and Whitaker. Thomas knocked lightly, and when there was no answer, he tried the handle. It was locked. "We need a different approach," he murmured, leading Katherine back downstairs. In the lobby, he approached the building's caretaker, an older man who was polishing the brass railings. "Excuse me," Thomas said pleasantly. "I was supposed to meet with Mr. Reynolds, but it seems I've missed him. Do you know when he might return?" The caretaker shrugged. "Mr. Reynolds usually takes a long lunch. Probably won't be back until 2 or so. You can wait if you like or come back later." "I might do that," Thomas replied. "By the way, I understand Mr. Reynolds recently moved to a new residence. My wife and I were hoping to send a housewarming gift, but I seem to have misplaced the address." The caretaker gave them an appraising look, but Thomas's earnest expression seemed to satisfy him. "He's got that new place on Sherman Street," he said. "Number 1425. Fancy brownstone, can't miss it." "Much obliged," Thomas said with a tip of his hat, leading Katherine outside. "That was impressive," she whispered once they were on the street. Thomas grinned. "People are generally helpful if you seem like you belong. Now we know where he lives." Let's take a look at the house while he's still at lunch." They made their way to Sherman Street, finding number 1425 without difficulty. It was indeed a fancy brownstone, as the caretaker had described, a tall, narrow townhouse with elaborate stonework and a small, well-maintained garden in front. "How do we get in?" Katherine asked as they walked past, trying not to look too obvious in their surveillance. "We don't, not yet," Thomas replied. "First, we need to know when he's not home. Does he have servants, a wife? What's his schedule?" They spent the remainder of the day observing the house from various vantage points, noting when Victor returned home in the late afternoon. Through an open window, they glimpsed a maid working inside, and a cook arrived shortly after Victor, presumably to prepare dinner. As evening fell, they returned to their boarding house, formulating a plan for the next day. They would watch both the office and the house, establishing Victor's routine, and look for an opportunity to search for the earrings. That night, as Thomas arranged a makeshift bed on the floor, Katherine sat on the edge of the bed, watching him. "Thomas," she said softly, "I've been thinking about what happens after this. If we find the earrings, if we clear my name." He looked up at her, his expression questioning. "What about it? Where will you go? What will you do?" Thomas sat back on his heels, considering the question. "I hadn't thought that far ahead," he admitted. "Back to the mountains, I suppose, back to the horses." Katherine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "Of course, that makes sense." Thomas studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the emotion she was trying to conceal. "What about you?" he asked gently. "Would you go back to Anima's Forks?" She shook her head. "I don't think I could. Too many painful memories now. I thought perhaps Denver or maybe even further east. I've always wanted to see California." "California's west," Thomas said with a small smile. Katherine laughed softly. "See, I need someone to point me in the right direction." Their eyes met across the small room, and the unspoken feelings between them seemed to fill the space. "Katherine," Thomas began, his voice husky. When this is over, a knock at their door interrupted him, making them both jump. Thomas moved to answer it, finding their landlady on the other side. "Sorry to disturb you folks," she said, "but there's a notice being posted around town I thought you should see." She handed Thomas a piece of paper. "Being newcomers and all, I thought you might not be aware." Thomas thanked her and closed the door, unfolding the paper. His expression darkened as he read. "What is it?" Katherine asked, moving to his side. "Wanted posters," he said grimly, showing her the paper. "They've reached Denver." Katherine stared at the crude sketches of their faces, the descriptions of their supposed crimes. The reward now increased to $200 for information leading to their capture. "They're not giving up," she whispered. "No," Thomas agreed, "which means we need to move faster. Tomorrow, we find those earrings." The next morning they rose early, their plan refined after a night of discussion. They would focus on Victor's house, which seemed more likely to contain personal items like the stolen jewelry than his office. Thomas had noticed a pattern the previous day. The maid left the house around 10 in the morning, presumably to do shopping, and was gone for about an hour. They positioned themselves near the house before 9, watching as Victor departed for his office. At precisely 10:15, the maid emerged, basket in hand, and headed toward the market several blocks away. "Now's our chance," Thomas said, leading Katherine to the back of the house, where a small service entrance was less visible from the street. The door was locked, but Thomas produced a thin piece of metal from his pocket. "Picked up a few skills in my wandering days," he explained as he worked the lock. After a tense moment, there was a click, and the door swung open. They entered cautiously, finding themselves in a kitchen. The house was silent, confirming their belief that the cook only came in the evenings. They moved quickly but methodically through the first floor, searching for anything that might hold jewelry. "Upstairs," Katherine suggested. "The bedrooms." They climbed the stairs, wincing at every creak of the wooden steps. On the second floor, they found Victor's bedroom, a large, well-appointed room with heavy furniture and expensive drapes. "Look for a safe, a jewelry box, anything that might hold valuable items," Thomas directed. Moving to a large armoire against one wall, Katherine checked the dresser drawers, finding nothing but clothing neatly folded. She moved to a writing desk in the corner, pulling open drawers and examining their contents. "Thomas," she called softly, holding up a small leather-bound book with gold initials on the cover. "This is Jacob's diary, the one that was missing from his study." Thomas joined her, taking the diary and flipping through its pages. "This is it," he confirmed. "The combination to the safe must be in here. Victor used it to open the safe, then took it with him." They continued their search with renewed urgency. In a velvet-lined box in the bottom drawer of the writing desk, Katherine found what they had been looking for: a pair of diamond earrings, sparkling even in the dim light of the bedroom. "The earrings," she breathed. "These are them. I'd recognize them anywhere." Thomas examined them, then carefully returned them to the box. "We need to take these and the diary to the authorities. Not in Anima's Forks, they won't believe us there. But Denver has a federal marshal's office. They might listen." Just as he was speaking, they heard the front door open downstairs. They froze, exchanging alarmed glances. "The maid," Katherine whispered. "She's back early." They could hear footsteps moving through the house below. Thomas quickly closed the drawer, placing the diary and earrings in his pocket. "We need to leave. Now." They crept toward the bedroom door, but as they reached the hallway, they heard footsteps on the stairs. There was no time to hide. Thomas pushed Katherine behind him protectively as the maid reached the top of the stairs and saw them. Her eyes widened, and she opened her mouth to scream. Thomas moved swiftly, placing his hand gently but firmly over her mouth. "We're not going to hurt you," he said calmly. "We just need to leave. Do you understand?" The terrified woman nodded, her eyes still wide with fear. Thomas slowly removed his hand. "What are you doing in Mr. Reynolds's house?" she demanded, though her voice trembled. Katherine stepped forward. "We're looking for evidence. Victor Reynolds murdered his uncle and framed me for the crime." The maid's expression shifted from fear to confusion. "Mr. Jacob." "I knew Mr. Victor was upset about the will, but you knew about the will?" Thomas asked sharply. "About Jacob Reynolds changing it," the maid nodded reluctantly. "Mr. Victor was furious when he found out, said his uncle had lost his mind, leaving part of his estate to a housekeeper." Katherine and Thomas exchanged a meaningful glance. "Did you tell the sheriff this?" Katherine asked. "No," the maid admitted. "Mr. Victor gave me money to keep quiet, said it wasn't relevant." "It's very relevant," Thomas said firmly. "Victor Reynolds is a murderer and we can prove it." "But we need your help." The maid hesitated, clearly torn. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing," Thomas assured her. "Just let us leave. Pretend you never saw us." "And if you have any conscience at all," Katherine added, "come to the federal marshal's office this afternoon. Tell them what you know about Victor's reaction to the will." The maid considered this, then stepped aside. "Go," she said simply. "I didn't see you. They didn't need to be told twice." They hurried down the stairs and out the back door, making their way swiftly through the neighboring yards until they reached a busier street where they could blend with the crowd. "You think she'll talk to the marshal?" Katherine asked as they walked quickly away from Sherman Street. "I don't know," Thomas replied honestly. "But with the diary and earrings, we have solid evidence regardless. Let's go to the marshal's office now, before Victor discovers the items are missing." The federal marshal's office was located in a government building near the center of Denver. They approached cautiously, aware of the wanted posters that might be displayed inside. Thomas suggested that Katherine wait across the street while he went in first to assess the situation. "Be careful," she urged, squeezing his hand before letting him go. Thomas entered the building, removing his hat as he stepped into the marshal's office. A clerk looked up from a desk, eyeing him curiously. "Can I help you, sir?" "I need to speak with the marshal," Thomas said. "It's regarding a murder in Animas Forks." The clerk raised an eyebrow but went to a door at the back of the room, knocking before entering. He returned a moment later. "Marshal Hayes will see you." Thomas was shown into a spartanly furnished office where a broad-shouldered man with a silver star pinned to his vest sat behind a desk. Marshal Hayes had a weathered face that had seen its share of troubles, but eyes that suggested a keen intelligence. "What's this about a murder in Animas Forks?" he asked without preamble. Thomas took a deep breath and launched into the story how he'd witnessed Katherine's near execution, his certainty of her innocence, their investigation, and finally, the evidence they'd discovered pointing to Victor Reynolds as the real killer. The marshal listened without interruption, his expression giving away nothing. When Thomas finished, he leaned back in his chair. "That's quite a tale, Mr. Marshal, and you say you have evidence?" Thomas placed Jacob's diary and the box containing the earrings on the marshal's desk. "The diary contains the combination to Jacob Reynolds' safe, which is how Victor accessed it after killing his uncle. The earrings were stolen from Jacob's house the day of the murder. We found both in Victor Reynolds' possession." Marshal Hayes examined the items, then fixed Thomas with a penetrating stare. "You realize there are wanted posters for you and Miss Davis. Sheriff Blackstone has charged you both with serious crimes." "Yes," Thomas acknowledged, "but we're innocent. We've risked everything to find the truth." The marshal was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I've had dealings with Blackstone before, never much cared for his methods, too quick to judgment, especially where women and minorities are concerned." He stood up. "Where is Miss Davis now?" "Nearby," Thomas said cautiously. "I wanted to make sure it was safe before bringing her in." "Wise precaution," the marshal approved. "Bring her in. I'll hear her version of events as well, then we'll decide how to proceed." Thomas left the building, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He found Katherine waiting anxiously across the street, her face brightening when she saw his expression. "The marshal is willing to listen," he told her, taking her hands in his. "He wants to hear your account as well." Katherine's eyes filled with tears of relief. "Then there's hope." "More than hope," Thomas assured her. "I think we're going to clear your name." They returned to the marshal's office together, where Katherine recounted her version of events: finding Jacob's body, being accused by Sheriff Blackstone, her near execution, and their subsequent investigation. Marshal Hayes listened attentively, asking occasional questions to clarify details. When she had finished, the marshal nodded decisively. "I believe you, Miss Davis, both of you. This evidence," he gestured to the diary and earrings, "along with the testimony of the maid, if we can secure it, should be enough to charge Victor Reynolds with the murder of his uncle." "And what about the charges against us?" Thomas asked. "I'll send a telegram to the territorial governor explaining the situation," Marshal Hayes replied. "In the meantime, I'll need you both to remain in Denver. Not under arrest," he added, seeing their expressions, "but available for further questions if needed." They agreed readily, relieved that their ordeal might soon be over. The marshal asked them to return the next morning, by which time he hoped to have Victor Reynolds in custody for questioning. As they left the federal building, the weight of the past days seemed to lift from their shoulders. They walked through the streets of Denver, no longer quite so fearful of being recognized, though still cautious. "I can hardly believe it," Katherine said as they found a quiet spot in a small park to rest. "After everything, we might actually have done it." Thomas took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "You never gave up. That's what I admire about you, Katherine. Even when things seemed hopeless, you kept fighting." She looked up at him, her eyes soft in the late afternoon light. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Thomas. You saved my life in more ways than one." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken feelings. Then, slowly, Thomas leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle kiss. Katherine responded immediately, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest. When they finally parted, both were slightly breathless. "I've been wanting to do that for days," Thomas admitted with a small smile. Katherine returned his smile, a blush coloring her cheeks. "I've been hoping you would." That evening, they returned to their boarding house with lighter hearts and a newfound awareness of the feelings growing between them. Though they still maintained the pretense of being married for their landlady's benefit, there was a different quality to their interactions now: tender glances, lingering touches, the promise of something more once their troubles were behind them. The next morning, they returned to the marshal's office as instructed. Marshal Hayes greeted them with good news: Victor Reynolds had been taken into custody late the previous night, and upon being confronted with the evidence, had confessed to his uncle's murder. "He broke down completely," the marshal told them. "Admitted he killed his uncle in a rage over the changed will, then framed Miss Davis because he knew she was the beneficiary. He even confirmed that he planted evidence in her quarters to implicate her." "And Sheriff Blackstone?" Thomas asked. "Was he involved?" "Not directly," Marshal Hayes replied. "Reynolds insists Blackstone genuinely believed Miss Davis was guilty. However, the sheriff's handling of the case was negligent at best, possibly criminal in his haste to execute without proper evidence." "What happens now?" Katherine asked, hardly daring to believe their ordeal was truly ending. "I've sent telegrams to the governor and to Animas Forks," the marshal explained. "All charges against both of you have been dropped. You're free to go wherever you please, though I may need to call you as witnesses when Reynolds stands trial." Katherine felt tears of relief spring to her eyes, and Thomas squeezed her hand supportively. "Thank you, Marshal," she said, "for believing us when no one else would." "Thank your friend here," Marshal Hayes replied with a nod toward Thomas. "Not many would risk their neck for a stranger the way he did for you." They left the marshal's office with written confirmation of their cleared names, official documents that would protect them from any further trouble with the law. On the steps outside, Katherine turned to Thomas, her eyes shining with emotion. "It's over," she said wonderingly. "We did it." Thomas smiled down at her, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "We did. And now we can decide what comes next." "And what does come next, Thomas Marshall?" Katherine asked softly. He took both her hands in his. "Last night I was thinking about what you said, about California." His blue eyes were earnest as he continued, "I've never seen the Pacific Ocean either. Maybe we could see it together." Katherine's heart soared at his words. "Are you asking me to come with you?" "I'm asking for more than that," Thomas said, his voice deepening with emotion. "These past days have shown me something I've been missing my whole life, something I found when I looked up and saw you on that gallows." "And what's that?" Katherine asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "A purpose. A home." He drew her closer. "I love you, Katherine Davis. I think I started falling for you the moment I saw your courage in the face of death, and every moment since has only made me more certain." Tears of joy spilled onto Katherine's cheeks. "I love you too, Thomas. You saved my life, but more than that, You showed me what it means to truly live to fight for what's right, to never give up hope." Their second kiss was deeper, filled with the promise of a future together. When they finally parted, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "So, California?" he asked with a smile. Katherine laughed, the sound bright with happiness. "California," she agreed, "though there's something we should do first." "What's that?" Her eyes twinkled mischievously. "Make honest folks of ourselves. My father would have a fit knowing I'm traveling across the country with a man who isn't my husband." Thomas's face broke into a wide grin. "Katherine Davis, are you proposing to me?" "Well, someone has to take the initiative," she teased. "You've been rather slow on that front." He laughed, lifting her off her feet in a joyful embrace. "In that case, yes, I accept your proposal." 3 days later, they were married in a small ceremony at Denver's church, with Marshall Hayes and his wife as witnesses. Katherine wore a simple white dress purchased with part of the reward money the marshal had insisted they accept for their role in capturing a murderer. Thomas had splurged on a new suit, looking handsomer than ever as he placed a simple gold band on Katherine's finger. They left Denver the following day, heading west by train toward the promise of California and a new life together. As mountains gave way to deserts and eventually the vast Pacific, they created a home and a life that neither had dared dream possible before that fateful day in Animas Forks. Years later, their children would beg to hear the story of how their parents met a tale that grew no less thrilling in the telling, though Thomas would always downplay his heroism, and Katherine would insist he was being modest. "Your father is the bravest man I've ever known," she would tell their wide-eyed children. "He risked everything for a woman he'd never met, all because he couldn't stand to see an injustice done." And Thomas would smile at his wife across their cozy California home, still seeing in her the same courage and spirit that had captured his heart on that gallows platform, when a single shot had severed not just a rope, but also the loneliness that had defined both their lives until that moment.